So to start out, how do utilities make money? It's a little bit of an old-fashioned way of making money. So you can see here, we've got a little bit of a fossilized process going on that we want to talk to you about today. So in the late 1800s is when Iowa utilities were established as monopolies by the legislature. That means when you buy a house in an area, when you move into a certain area, you don't have a choice about where your electricity comes from. You pay your bill, and that's it. The purpose of this was really designed to create efficiencies for the infrastructure that needed to be built. The utilities agreed to be regulated by the Iowa Utilities Board. And this is especially important for those utilities that are for-profit utilities, particularly Alliant and MidAmerican Energy. So why do we regulate utilities? Why do we need to regulate utilities? A lack of regulatory oversight can really lead to inefficiencies, to say the least, in utility operations. So one expert puts it like this: effective regulation replicates the pressures of competition. The state, through its commission, takes the place of competition and furnishes the regulation which competition cannot give. Because if a competitive enterprise tried to impose on its customers costs from actions that didn't make sense or were imprudent, then the customers could take their business to a more efficient provider. But utility ratepayers in a monopoly situation have no such choice. So it's important to understand that it is the Iowa Utilities Board, the regulators, who provide the regulation at the end of the day, but it's the legislature in Iowa that sets the rules for regulation. So in Iowa, the way our system is set up is that utilities have an incentive to own a lot of stuff. They are supposed to be providing rates that are based on the cost of providing service, and they're supposed to be showing that all of the things that they've built and that they continue to operate and that we continue to pay for are considered to be used and useful, meaning they really are being used to provide this affordable, reliable, safe service for us. But their profit structure is not aligned with the goals stated earlier around safety, reliability, affordability. So utility profits for Alliant and MidAmerican are based on building and operating things. They are legally guaranteed a profit, often ranging between 9 and 11%, on top of being able to collect the cost of whatever they built. They also collect a profit on top of that directly from Iowa ratepayers. They have an incentive to keep building more stuff, and at the same time, there's not really a good mechanism to evaluate that building stuff versus what is really best for ratepayers on balance. There's no requirements for any kind of competition or anything that simulates competition in that process of deciding what to build. And in Iowa, there is also laws that limit the requirements that utilities try to keep rates lower by using energy more efficiently. Energy efficiency is the lowest cost resource. It's a way of lowering load before you even have to build something new. And that was severely limited by legislation that passed in 2018. Our utilities here also are allowed to sell power out of state, and they do sell a lot of power out of state, even while we in Iowa are continuing to pay for the upkeep of all of their coal-fired facilities at the same time. So in 2022, MidAmerican sold 38% of the power they produced outside of the state of Iowa, while Alliant sold 15%. So to summarize the kind of system that we have developed here, we start with building things. That cost gets passed along to ratepayers, including that 9 to 11% profit. We keep the old things and build more things without evaluating whether or not the old things still make sense to keep online. We pass along more costs to ratepayers. And then we keep old things and build even more new things with even more costs going to utility ratepayers. And so you can see, as you build more and more and that circle gets bigger and bigger, the slice of the pie that is the profit, the additional percentage, also grows, right? So utilities want to keep that profit margin growing. So they don't really have an incentive to do their own math on, hey, should we maybe shut down an old facility as we're building a new facility? Do we need to invest in wind or solar as our next resource? What really makes sense for our customers? The real incentive structure is set up to just grow and grow. In the 2023 legislative session, House File 617 was passed. And this was a law that requires the Iowa Utilities Board to initiate a process of reviewing rate-making processes in Iowa to take into account those elements of safety, adequacy, reliability, and affordability. And part of that process is to identify possible changes in state law, make recommendations for those changes going into the 2024 legislative session. And that process is already underway. The Utilities Board has hired a third party, London Economics, to facilitate the analysis. They've held 2 stakeholder meeting processes with a lot of input and filings going back and forth. The third stakeholder meeting will be November 1st and 2nd. And then after that, London Economics will issue their report early next year. So it's really interesting, the things that have risen to the top in this process as IEC staff have been involved and our partners have been involved in all of the stakeholder meetings. And we've been filing our own comments, reading what other people are saying. And really the bottom line is that we have a number of folks who are involved in the process who are some of your most sophisticated customers, some of the largest customers of electricity in Iowa. They're really interested in this process because they use a lot of energy. They're a really big part of their business expenses. These are folks like ADM and John Deere, and they come together to form these organizations such as the Iowa Business Energy Coalition. IBEC has said in their comments that Iowa's advanced rate-making laws and procedures do not align with the state policy objectives of affordable and reliable service. And they identify as a case in point our lack of requirements to conduct integrated resource planning before filing an application for advanced rate making. And we're going to get into integrated resource planning, IRP. That's something you're going to hear out of my mouth a lot from here on out in this webinar. Integrated resource planning is really the thing we're here to talk about today, to try to undo those growing bubbles of capital investments that we talked about earlier. The Office of Consumer Advocate is another entity that advocates actually for all Iowa customers. And they're really the most important advocate, especially for ratepayers like you and me, residential ratepayers, small business ratepayers. They're our voice in front of the Utilities Board. And they have also noted that a lack of a formal long-term resource planning has contributed to IPL's Alliant Energy, IPL's costly resource decisions that drive higher utility rates. It's important to incorporate a specific and ongoing collaborative resource planning obligation. Going on here, the Large Energy Group, another group of big customers, mostly in Alliant service territory, points out that almost all of the non-utility interveners here, the folks participating in this process, support a clearly defined integrated resource planning process, and LEG is in that boat as well. The Iowa Economic Alliance, again, points to the importance of resource planning to get a holistic view of our whole utility system. And that's not all. Iowa Business for Clean Energy is another entity that, again, is telling us resource planning, it's what we need. So it's clearly time for reform here in Iowa. We have had a lot of things changing and transitioning. The last time we had significant energy legislation was really in 2001. It's been over 20 years since we've really looked at our utility regulatory process. And much like anything that, we were all doing 20 years ago, it's not necessarily a good fit for what's happening in Iowa today. Let's talk a little bit about what are the larger forces at work that are really driving us towards a need for change. So first of all, an analysis earlier this year by Energy Innovation showed that 99% of U.S. coal plants are currently more expensive just to operate than it would be to fully replace them with wind or solar, 99% across the country. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the federal act passed last year, is expected to drive down costs even more. An analysis by ICF found that the IRA would drive down costs by 35% for solar and 49% for wind. So that cost differential is just going to get even more lopsided. And so continuing to keep these coal plants online when the cost differential is so extreme is just clearly bad for customers. The IRA is also expected to triple renewable energy by 2030. And all of those things, these economic forces and incentives driving us towards renewable energy means that planning is more important than ever. We know that it's really important to integrate renewable energy into the grid in a way that is complementary, that wind and solar are complementary to each other, that you need storage and transmission to make the whole system work smoothly so that we are getting power around the clock the way that we need it. And so it's really important to not do this in a piecemeal way, but to do it with really careful and thoughtful planning. Another element that's important to note is that the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Financing Program, that's a mouthful, folks refer to it in short as the EIR, is another piece that was in the Inflation Reduction Act that is huge for utility customers in terms of lowering costs of transitioning away from coal and fossil fuels to renewable energy. So this program reduces the cost of coal plant retirements and transmission upgrades by basically lowering the interest rate that utilities pay on those assets, so they don't need to get such a large rate of return. And it requires that 100% of those benefits from refinancing the assets go to the impacted communities. And so we can look at not only, lowering the cost for all ratepayers of that transition, but actually investing in things like worker retraining in communities that are impacted by coal plant shutdowns and things like that. So we're excited about the possibility of that program, and we certainly don't think it would be wise for Iowa's utilities to leave that on the table while it's available. So you can see, Iowa, obviously we've gone through a massive generation change since 2000. So we used to be very heavily coal. We've had a large expansion in wind energy, and then our use of methane gas has also increased somewhat over time. However, even as our generation has increased, we have not taken very much coal capacity offline. So those plants are all still operating, and we're paying the upkeep costs of the coal plants, even though we're using them less. So again, just to reiterate the current system in Iowa. So this is what we're starting with, and this is how it's playing out in the real world. So some of these headlines, the Iowa Utilities Board is setting this public meetings, or it did set public meetings for Alliant's proposed rate increase, which they did recently file. So once again, we have Alliant Energy raising their rates on customers in their service territory, as the forward-looking planning isn't necessarily happening in a consistent way. The utilities are not voluntarily sharing this information with folks. So just a couple of headlines here to reiterate. MidAmerican, when they filed their wind prime filing, we had a lot of back and forth about some information that we wanted to see, and it wasn't just in wind prime, but there was a number of times when the utilities board had requested specific information about forward-looking resource planning for MidAmerican that they had refused to provide until really forced to provide it. And once they did, we got information that they had been doing resource planning, and it looked a little bit different than what their public projects were showing. And so it looked quite a bit different than what their public projects were showing. But that was really an unwillingness to even share the information about what their own models were showing. That can't be how things are done. With a regulated utility that is a monopoly, where we have no choice in where we buy our power, it cannot be that information like that is shut out from stakeholders and even from the regulators. So the way we fix that broken, inflated balloon is through more of a circular process, something called integrated resource planning, as I mentioned, IRP. So if we want these things, a reasonably priced, reliable, and safe system, we need to start at the top of the circle with transparent and system-wide integrated resource planning, an IRP. This is a process that I'll get into a little bit more later, but included in that process really needs to be also a competitive process to choose projects so that you have an RFP where folks are competing against each other to actually build the generation that's identified in the plan. Your plan needs to include energy efficiency and distribution system planning. So the distribution system are the littler lines that carry power and energy to our house. Those are things the utilities are working on all the time. That can include things like customer-owned generation in that side of the plan as well. And then you've got to go ahead and implement the plan as it's been conceived, and then you start over again. 2 or 3 years usually is the process for utilities to go through their plan and look at the numbers again, because things are changing so rapidly. So it's a cycle that you go through that instead of growing bigger, bigger, you figure out, how do we right size the system for what customers need in Iowa that gets us the best cost at the end of the day? Some of the benefits of doing an integrated resource plan, through this process of talking with stakeholders, you get to understand what the people and the communities and the businesses really are looking for in your service territory. Utility comes to understand that. They get to look at the long-term risks, but make the changes as the circumstances change, like I said, with an ongoing cycle of evaluation. And then with an IRP, you can find the low-cost solutions. So for example, NIPSCO in Indiana, their IRP projected that they would save $4 billion compared to business as usual. And they went out for a competitive procurement of bids for the energy in their plan, and they were 50% as expensive as the cost of running their coal in Indiana. Similarly, in Indiana, Vectren made an IRP that saved $320 million over 20 years, while also reducing emissions by 75%. And then up in Minnesota, Xcel Energy saved $372 million by updating their IRP in response to stakeholder input. And that savings was gained through actually building less gas and more renewable energy. So some of the hallmarks of a good IRP are adequate regulatory oversight. So like I said, you need the plans filed on a regular basis, and the regulator needs to have the ability to approve, deny, or modify those plans within the public interest. And then those plans should go into informing other processes, like when a utility wants to build something, that something should be the thing that was identified in the plan, unless they can justify it as cost effective or a good choice in some other way. It should be consistent with the plan. It should really have a lot of quantitative modeling and analysis. You want really good inputs that are non-biased, so it's not just the utility getting the results that they hope to get, but that there's stakeholder input and that those inputs are coming from actual data of the utility or a third-party source. It's really important that in an IRP, energy efficiency and distributed generation are on equal footing with a utility building new generation, because you want to look for the lowest cost portfolio. And then you also, in that process, really want to allow retirement of facilities that are no longer economic and are not needed for reliability purposes either. I have transparency in capital letters there. That's a really important principle for us, is that these processes are transparent and that they can be reworked by others who are interested in the process to know how the results were calculated. And then we're looking at doing a 15 to 20 year planning horizon, not short term, but really long term here. A few more things to highlight: the competitive procurement piece. There should be a streamlined process to get competitive bids, to introduce some of that cost lowering forces in here. And then another interesting thing that some folks are doing, some utilities are doing, is called all source procurement. And that basically says, here are the kinds of things we're looking for. We need we need this much capacity, we're looking for reliability, we have, these hours that we need to cover, and then folks can submit bids that are a mix of different resources as long as they meet all of those needs. So someone could come in with, a solar and storage project with some wind or something like that, but the utility doesn't pick the generation, they just pick the attributes, and then the folks submit the bids with different combinations of options. You definitely want your IRP to be supportive of reliability. There are lots of different ways to test that. You can do a stress test of any proposed resource mix over every hour of the day around the year in lots of different circumstances and figure out whether it's going to be a reliable mix for the future. And that's really important. And then, of course, transparency and public engagement. So what's next? This is a lot of information that I've thrown at you. I hope that folks have been thinking of questions. I will elaborate as much as I can, and we'll also be doing our best to continue to provide more educational opportunities for you. But at this point in time, it's just really important to start to think about this as something that is important to get involved in both now and going into the upcoming legislative session. We're really asking folks to sign up at our Flip the Switch website to keep receiving updates and to really become advocates for integrated resource planning, because it's really, customers like us, residential customers, commercial customers, small business customers, that are going to need to make our voices heard. And we're not alone in this. Like I pointed out earlier, the large industrial customers are also, very much in support of integrated resource planning. We just really need to let policymakers know that this is important to us. I really appreciate your time and attention today, and I'll wrap there and let Marshall take over for questions.
Great. So thank you so much, Carrie, for giving that presentation. And a couple of thoughts while you were going through the presentation. Just last week, IEC hosted a series of legislative tours throughout southern Iowa, in Burlington and Ottumwa, alongside the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the union of electricians down there. And so we got a lot of information about particularly solar projects and energy efficiency projects down there. And we got to tour around with a lot of state legislators. And you mentioned about upkeep, and one thing that the IBEW reps kept talking about is how little upkeep these solar and projects need once they're up off the ground. They don't have moving mechanical parts, that sort of thing. Whereas all coal plants, they kind of require a sort of constant maintenance and upkeep because there's so many parts under a lot of heat and stress at all times. Not only, like you were saying, the 99% of all coal plants are more costly to keep than to replace with wind and solar. And it's also just the maintenance over the lifespan of the power project. So they're really emphatic about that when talking to the legislators. One thing I did want to pose to you is some folks on the call may have seen MidAmerican Energy making claims about 100% clean energy in the last year. How are they claiming this? But if we know they also still have coal plants.
Yeah, sure. So, I think that goes back to the statistic I shared earlier around the exports of electricity out of Iowa. Now, we're not necessarily anti-export. We know that Iowa, can produce a ton of wind, and that, moving energy around in the Midwest, even between regions, is really important. But MidAmerican is overproducing about 38%. They're producing 38% more electricity than we actually use in the state of Iowa. And so in that 38% is where they shift all of that coal generation so that they can produce enough kilowatt hours or megawatt hours of wind energy to theoretically cover all of the megawatt hours used by their Iowa customers, while continuing to run their coal plants sort of under the radar. The problem with that is that all of the pollution from those plants is still, going into the water and the air. It is still polluting the communities where these coal plants are operating. And so, for them to say 100% renewable when we know they have one of the largest fleets of coal plants in the country still operating, think is, we know that that's not accurate. And so we think it's really important to make a claim or to set a goal that's really based on the needs that exist to reduce that pollution. And that goal would be real about like the actual percentage of renewable energy versus the percentage of coal that they're still operating.
Cool. And I think that kind of segues into, we have a comment from Tom Wind. He says, as an engineer that has worked in both the utility resource and transmission planning area and as an owner of wind generation and solar, he is concerned about the reliability of the grid during generation shortage periods. He certainly thinks we need to burn a lot less coal in the future, but thinks we should be careful about prematurely retiring firm generation, needing to find a way to keep the grid reliable by reducing carbon emissions. Grid reliability is critical. Look what happened to Texas 2 years ago during the cold spell. I take his point well made, but I think an interesting thing when referencing Texas is unique compared to most other states because they have isolated their grid from the rest of the United States. So they, in a critical shortfall like the cold snap they dealt with, they couldn't pull power from Arizona, Oklahoma, any of the surrounding states without a lot of difficulty because they have an isolated grid. But I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that Texas is an interesting example, both for the reason that you've stated and because most of the cascading outages were really because of natural gas wellheads freezing and infrastructure that had not been winterized, even though they had been warned previously that should be the case. And it was really a lot of under-regulation in Texas that led to some of those situations and the failure of fossil fuels to pull their weight. And we're actually seeing that increasingly that, coal piles freeze. In a drought, you don't have adequate water to keep a coal plant running. Nuclear plants also use a lot of water. And so some of our resource constraints that we think, renewables are weather responsive. Well, actually everything is weather responsive, but it points to some of the increased reliability risks that we really do face right now. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting that I've learned through this process is about this stress testing that I mentioned before, that you can do the resource expansion modeling. And it's really compared to some of what used to be used for resource expansion modeling, it's much more dynamic than it used to be in terms of looking at if you pushed here, what pops out here, what lever, what levers move MISO and then end up changing wholesale prices. And then, it's a very, very dynamic modeling system. And then whatever outputs you get, do a range of outputs, there's modeling that you do to stress test all of those scenarios to figure out what is this going to work or not? Where does this mean we need more transmission, et cetera? And I think one of the things that's troubling to me is that it's not clear to me that our utilities are doing that at all right now. It seems like they're relying on the MISO resource adequacy requirement, and that's kind of it. And I don't know that definitively, but certainly they have not come out and said we're already doing that. We don't need to do that. So I think that, an IRP could actually be a step up towards increasing the grid reliability and doing some of those dynamic modeling, and then have that as an input into the MISO process, so that as MISO is doing their grid planning, they're taking that into account, and they're building transmission where it's needed, and that, the utilities are also, they should be thinking about the transmission needs, but they should also be thinking about where can we use non-generation alternatives like demand response, energy efficiency, customer side renewables, microgrids, things like that, and be a little innovative and not just keep doing the same old thing. So it's a great question, Tom, and I'm so happy to see your name and to hear you on the webinar today. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. And then we also have a question from Brian Fleming. What have you seen regarding the 10% adder tax credit from the IRA and, quote, areas where coal plants have been shuttered?
Yeah, so I think that's a very exciting policy that was put into place in terms of the IRA. So for the wind and solar tax credits, you can get a 10% higher tax credit if you locate it in an energy community, one that has had a mine or a coal plant or fossil fuel infrastructure closed very recently or currently has something like that running. We have been working to make sure people are aware of that information. We know the utilities are well aware of that information, but we also want just people who live in those communities to know, because that applies to individuals who want to do solar as well and things like that. And so we're working on just getting the word out there because it's not all that well known yet. I haven't seen a lot of changes pop up related to that yet. I would love to do kind of a rundown analysis of where projects are starting to pop up post IRA, and find out whether that is driving any of that development, because I don't have a good fix on it yet. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because it's an important transition element as well for these communities to replace their tax base. You know, if you lose a large employer, a big taxpayer in the community, it's really designed to, let's bring in some new tax base, some good jobs, keep those transmission jobs in the community, et cetera.
Yeah, that was definitely something that came up a lot during our legislative tours in Burlington and Ottumwa. The IBEW is definitely preparing and excited for these sort of tax credits that emphasize those smaller communities and the good paying union, or at least prevailing wage jobs, because that's something else. The IRA prioritizes prevailing wage jobs, so union, but also non-union shops that pay union wages. So there was a lot of excitement both on the solar construction side and on the builders and operators side down there on our tour. So
yeah, that's a great point, Marshall, because yes, like in order to get the full tax credit of 30%, you also, like you said, you need to pay workers prevailing wage. And that means also that these are going to be good jobs and more likely to be local jobs in these communities, which they have not always been. And so we're really excited to see that real investment in the communities and in the people of the communities where these projects are located.
all right. Rod Stevens says, this also assumes that the Iowa Utilities Board is not loaded with political appointees who are heavily utility-centric and have a utility consumer's best interest in mind. Do you want to address this?
You know, part of the reason that we're talking to you today is because it's really, there are a lot of power structures, you know, that exist that have been established and don't necessarily run through people directly, right? So we elect our governor, the governor appoints the utilities board members. They do go through confirmation by the Senate. Some states elect their utility commissioners. You know, that can also lead to the issue of the moment becoming the thing that, you know, gets a utility commission elected. So, but I think it points to the reason why engagement is really important. And like I said, it's the IUB regulates, but the legislature sets the expectations and the rules of the road. And that's why it's really important for policymakers to know that customers across the board are really saying this process is broken. It is not working for us anymore. That's why I'm so glad that so many folks showed up today for this. And I would really ask that for all of us to use our voices with policymakers to let them know it's time. It's time for IRPs.
Yeah, and I think queuing into what you said during the presentation, a lot of this is we, the citizens, also don't know. You know, it goes beyond the IUB, obviously Iowa Environmental Council. We represent over 100 organizations and businesses that care about the future of an environmentally sustainable Iowa. And our job as advocates for the community is more difficult because we don't know the roadmap that the utilities. So this is IRP certainly is very important for the utilities board, but it's also important for every environmental and energy advocate in the state. It's about getting all that information in front of us into our hands so that we can then be informed citizens when talking to our legislators.
That's a great point, Marshall. Yep, that overall transparency. And then we're also able to be on more equal footing, even when having a direct conversation with the utilities, right? So we're all talking about the same thing. We're not trying to pretend things aren't the way they are, or dodge or hide anything. It's a direct conversation when that transparency is allowed to be an integral part of the process.
Okay, and so we have two questions, one from Tom Wynn and one from Lisa McNeil, that are around the same lines. Tom asks, how can we get more involved? And Lisa asks, is there upcoming legislation that we citizens should be watching out for? And maybe this is a time to talk about our OCA push.
So one way to get more involved, if you go to the Flip the Switch website, you'll find there is a link there where you can contact the Office of Consumer Advocate. As I mentioned earlier, the OCA has been good on this issue of integrated resource planning, but we want them to know that there is a lot of public support from that for the customers that they work hard to represent, residential and small business customers. We really want OCA to know that there is a lot of public support for this process. And so that's one way to begin taking action, is by contacting the OCA. We'll also be reaching out to people as the fall progresses about starting to contact your local legislators. And you can do that now if you know who those folks are, but we'll also be providing more information about how you can start to have those conversations, because we think it's really critical that people start to hear from their constituents about this, that it really is an issue that is impacting people in Iowa, and it's not one that can just be solved at the State House kind of behind closed doors, but it's one that hits our pocketbooks across the state. It's really important. Those are two ways that we can begin to get involved. There is also, if you've filed a comment in a docket before, you could also put weigh in the docket itself. If you are up of that, if you want to do that, it's NOI 2023-0001. That's mostly for the benefit of Tom, who I think has done some of this before, but that would be another way to weigh in directly with some of your thoughts. Or get in touch with me, get in touch with Marshall, Cody, Jordan, on our staff. This is something that a lot of us are working on because it's really important.
I think I just really want to emphasize, like, integrated resource planning is not unusual. I really want to hammer home. So when you are reaching out, speaking with legislators and speaking with business owners and stuff about getting involved, I believe the count is 35 states require integrated resource planning. So we're actually the weird ones not having it. Almost all of the Midwest has it. And Carrie mentioned that we have small business customers concerned about this, but we also know we have large business customers. There are several of the big data companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and the like, who run a lot of their data centers out of Iowa. And part of the reason they do that is because we have such a strong wind energy mix, and they're trying to achieve corporation-wide renewable energy power. And so they really want to see in Iowa that it's headed towards 100% clean energy. And that means more jobs here, more tax money coming here. So it's really a win-win for everyone, which is, I think, why we're seeing broad support for integrated resource planning in this charrette process from pretty much everyone except the utilities, because they don't want to do it. It's extra work. But hey, there's got to be some sort of trade-off for being a monopoly, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And to be more specific for Lisa's question, there's not a bill right now. We're still in the run up to session. The next thing that we'll probably see is that report from London Economics. We're working to schedule a follow-up webinar in November to debrief on sort of how the process wraps up with the charrettes at the Iowa Utilities Board, and to talk about sort of our outline for what we think needs to be included in legislation in the upcoming year. I think, one of the most important things that we need to be doing is to really be building momentum for something to be done. It's easy to say, oh, let's just wait. We don't need to do anything right now. Kind of let a report sit on the shelf, and we just don't have time or money to keep letting this system sort of sit on the shelf and gather dust while we're all wondering, what's coming next.
And I really want to emphasize, as some folks have alluded to, the political question when it comes to this. We haven't been seeing a broad resistance from the idea around IRP necessarily from any political corner, because ultimately at the end we are seeing this is a conversation about the future of Iowa, about the cost to ratepayers, which it's across the board. It has nothing to do with your political affiliation. You have to pay for power. I know at least on our legislative tours last week, we had folks from both parties who expressed a lot of interest in wanting to know more about what the future of energy looks like in Iowa. And so that's really what we're pushing for here. This is a push for information. Information is good for everyone, regardless of your political goals. You need information to make strong political goals. So that's what we're really advocating for here. All right, well, we've got a little bit of time if anyone has a question, or otherwise we can start wrapping this up. I want to let everyone know that a recording of this will be made available to everyone, and we are also hosting a second presentation of this webinar next Tuesday, October 24th at 5:30 p.m. in the evening. So if you have any friends, colleagues who wanted to see this presentation, but this was an inconvenient time for them, we hope that other time might be convenient for them. And we will be doing a lot more work on this Flip the Switch campaign. You should be seeing some explainer videos going up online that we'll be sharing around, and a lot more information will be continuously updated at the Flip the Switch website. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up here. I want to thank Carrie for rounding up all this information and giving it out to us all. And keep an eye on your emails. We will do a follow-up email with links to all of this stuff that we talked about. So thank you all for signing in today and checking this out with us.